So please watch this video after you've watched the video Artisans and Traders, that Out of the Past series, where they introduce you to the topic of archaeology and ancient economy. So watch that first. You can answer the questions and submit them on Blackboard by Sunday. And what this video is going to do is kind of recap some of what they talked about, but also add a little bit of information as well. So you saw in the video that economic systems are really composed of three parts. It's the production, the distribution or exchange of goods, and the consumption of those goods. So you could have a political economy, you could have a subsistence economy. So all societies have economies. In the most basic sense, a hunting and gathering society would have a simple subsistence economy where there's production of food, gathering of food, hunting of wild animals, distribution of the meat to other members of the tribe, and then the consumption of that. They would also make goods, they would exchange with other groups. That would be part of the economy as well. But you saw that there are degrees. There are simple economies and more complex economies. And more complex economies are typical of large states and civilizations. Okay, so archaeologists like to try and figure out how an economy and the different parts of the economy, the subsistence economy, the trade economy, the craft good economy, how all of these were organized. And so one thing they look at is production, where things were produced and trying to identify it archaeologically, and also specialization, if it exists, and how high a degree of specialization was there. Now, craft specialization, like you saw, consists of people who make their living through their craft. They don't, let's say, work in the fields and grow wheat or corn or anything like that. They might produce something like those shell gorgets or something like that. You saw mano and metate makers, though they were part-time specialists, so they weren't full-time specialists. So there's degrees, and there's different types, independent and attached specialists, as we're going to see. Okay, so how do we figure out if there was specialization? Was it high levels of specialization, low levels of specialization? Well, one way is to look at the patterning of artifacts at a site. Right? So let's take an example. Let's say you've excavated a village. 30 houses were excavated, 28 have animal bones, stone tools, some broken shell, and some finished shell artifacts. 2 houses have animal bones, some stone tools, and lots of broken shell. Scenario 2, right? 30 houses excavated, 30 houses of animal bones, stone tools, some broken shell, and some finished shell artifacts. In which village do you have specialists? Well, one of the keys here is recognizing the evidence of production. We've already talked a little bit about this, but you saw when you were making stone tools, production areas have the garbage that comes from making those things, but not necessarily the final products. Right? So in scenario 1, we have 28 houses that have some finished shell artifacts, right? A little bit of broken shell, right? But 2 houses have lots of broken shell. Whereas in scenario 2, right, all of the houses have pretty much the same thing. Some broken shell and some finished shell artifacts. Now, like we saw with those stone tools at Teachershuyuk, the Canaanian blade factory, where they had something like over 1,000 Canaanian blade cores. What we see here is lots of broken shell in these 2 houses, not necessarily the finished products. Those end up elsewhere. And these other houses don't have a lot of broken shell. So we would say that craft specialization of shell artifacts exists, or there's evidence of that in this first scenario. In the second scenario, it looks like all houses are engaged in the production of shell artifacts. All right, so specialization exists here, not necessarily here. This might have a little bit more of a complex economy, and by extension, a more complex society. Okay, so in order to identify production, there's different things that you might find. The debris, the installations to make those products. So, for example, in a pottery workshop, you would find firing pits where the final product would be fired. You might find kilns like here. You find molds maybe used to make some of the pottery, scrapers to thin the walls of the vessel, unworked clay, pigments. Here's a potter's wheel. If you found those things and maybe a few of the final products, this is probably where those things were produced. If you have a house with none of this stuff but lots of pottery, that doesn't mean that they were making the pottery there. They were consuming the pottery there. Okay, what about textiles? Textiles before the spinning wheel was developed, which is a rather recent invention. You would use something called a spindle whirl, right? This is how they would actually, before the spindle wheel, this is how they would actually spin fibers into yarn. They would have a little bit of a weight at the bottom, which was either a piece of stone or a piece of clay. They would spin this spindle. The fibers would twist and wrap around here, and they would continue to add fibers to it. Very labor intensive. So if textiles were being produced, you might find needles, spindle whirls. The wood may not survive, but the whirl would. Maybe weights for the loom. The loom might not survive because it's made of wood, but the weights, which would not be made of wood, might survive. Shuttles, which would be used on a loom as well. Right, so in an example like this, here's an upright loom, woman weaving. A lot of this stuff is made of perishable materials, so the textiles themselves may not survive. The fibers may not survive. The wood for the loom may not survive. What will survive? Maybe some of the bone that was used to tamp down the fibers, and the weights at the end of the weft to hold those strands in place. So those are the things that might survive archaeologically, and those are the things that would indicate to you, if you found them in an area of the site, that textile production was occurring there. Still today in parts of Mesoamerica, you can see traditional weaving going on. This is in the Maya region. You can see a woman spinning yarn using a spindle, and they still use a technology from ancient Maya times, a backstrap loom. So one end would be tied to a tree. The other end would be tied around the back of a person who could then put more or less tension on the weft. But they could also, using these boards, make the weft go in different directions. That makes the job take a lot less time. So this was a very efficient way of producing textiles. So we talked about Tichershuyu before and those Canadian blade cores. And we said that because the site was getting larger and larger and larger, there was a demand for these blades, right? And for the blades to harvest wheat. Because there was demand, there was the opportunity then to have craft specialization. And so in that one part of the site, you found 1,600 Canadian blade cores. Just a huge amount. So it looks like people in that area of the site were specialists. As we're going to see, they were independent specialists. That is, there was no control by leaders or elites. Leaders and elites would not necessarily want to control a good that is essentially utilitarian, something that is just used by people for everyday things. And when you think about markets and you think about supply and demand, right, in a complex economy, right, in order for specialization to exist, you have to have demand and you have to have a marketplace for those things to be traded. Right? So today, because of the internet, we have extreme specialization. Right? Imagine if you decided you were going to make handmade leather goods, right? So you decided, I'm going to make like wallets and change purses and things like that out of leather, handmade, and then you set up a store, on Lake Michigan Drive or the Woodland Mall or something like that. You may not make it, because how high would the demand be locally for that kind of stuff? I'm guessing not that high, right? Come the internet and come Etsy, now all of a sudden you have a marketplace and a worldwide demand, essentially, where you can get customers from all over the world, whereas maybe you'd sell a couple hundred of those things a year locally. Right? Now all of a sudden things are wide open. So the internet has really, really changed, as you guys already know, how specialization today functions. You can really be a specialist today because of the internet, because the demand is there and the market is there, right? That is, you actually have a place to sell your wares. Okay, another ancient civilization, the Indus in India, which was at the same time as ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. Some of these sites, they found workshops as well. Now you can tell that this is a shell bangle workshop. Here are some of the finished products, but a lot of the raw materials are stacked up here. These pieces of shell would be sliced into sections, producing essentially bracelets, like you could see here. Beads were also made, and so in the bead manufacturing area, what would you expect? Not a lot of the beads necessarily. Those get traded elsewhere, but lots of the raw stone that would be made into beads. It would be, the same as if you were making, let's say, that leather worker, that local leather worker. What would you find in their work, in their production area? Probably lots of pieces of raw leather ready to be turned into finished products. Okay, so raw materials, debris, tools, all of these things can identify production. Okay, what about greater and greater specialization? Well, let's take another scenario. Okay, scenario 1. Pottery in the village has a high degree of variability in size and decoration. Scenario 2. The pottery in the village is pretty similar and uses a few decorative motifs that are repeated over and over. In which scenario do you think was there higher specialization? If you guessed scenario 2, you are correct, right? Scenario 1 is probably the result of many people producing their own pottery. So there's lots of variability because people are going to make it differently. In scenario 2, the pottery is pretty consistent, showing that probably a few people made the pottery over and over, and they're using a very kind of similar technique each time, so to reduce the amount of time it takes to make a vessel. So if a few people are manufacturing things, that is greater specialization. If there's more standardization of what is being made, that is also greater standardization. So if you actually analyze artifacts, you can tell if a specialist made them or not by figuring out how much variability there is. And so I kind of think about if you were a celebrity and you were signing autographs, and you had to sign your signature on pictures 1,000 times in a row, right? By the 100th time, you would figure out, okay, I'm going to sign it the same every single time. Not because you want you want people to be able to authenticate it, but really because it would take you less time to do it if you did it the same exact way each and every time. If you were varying it up, then it's taking you more time and you're never going to get through that line of people. So, if you did this on your own, right, sign, what you would see is that a lot of those signatures would be pretty consistent with each other, and they would resemble each other very closely, versus, let's say, if you had people sign the same name, but different people were doing it. So, in some archaeological sites, the kiln sometimes melts pottery or makes pottery kind of break, and those pots can not longer be used. And these are called kiln wasters. And sometimes when you identify these kiln wasters, you can then measure them and see if there is a lot of standardization in those vessels. And if there is a lot of standardization, if they're pretty standardized, they were probably made by craft specialists. Right? So looking at the vessels, essentially looking at the variation, less variation, more standardization. Okay, so archaeologists would measure the thickness of, let's say, these vessels. These are vessels that were stacked up in the kiln. They all got messed up, and so they couldn't be traded. They were kind of fused together, melted together. So archaeologists measured the thickness, measured the diameter, right, of all these vessels. And what they saw is that they were all really close to each other. And what that means is that there was a high degree of specialization. This meaning that it was a complex society. If in order to have this, as we said before, you need a complex society, a market, the demand for these kind of niche industries to survive, something like pottery and things like that. So market and sufficient demand. You're only going to get that in a large, complex society. So, in a smaller scale society, making, let's say, certain crafts that are very, very specific, you may not be able to survive solely on producing that in that society. In a large city, you can survive doing that. Okay. Let's look at another aspect of specialization. That is attached versus independent specialists. Attached specialists are attached to elites. They're like that elite in the Maya world who is an elite themselves, who was producing shell gorgets, lived where the other elites were living, and was producing a good that was a prestige good for those elites. That is attached specialization. They tend to be controlled by elites, producing prestige goods. Independent specialists are people who are essentially entrepreneurs, you might say. They're not controlled by elites. They probably not producing prestige goods necessarily, might be producing things that everyone else kind of needs, but there's no evidence of control by leaders. Okay, so which one's the attached specialist? Scenario 1, maker of jade beads found living in an area where the nobility lives. Scenario 2, potters found in an average residential area. If you said scenario 1 is the attached specialist, you are absolutely right. Scenario 2, right? If they're not living with the elites, they're manufacturing things that are typically not, they could be prestige goods if they were very finely made, but in this case, they're probably not, we're assuming. They're living just sort of out where ordinary people live. This person's living, making prestige goods, living near the elites. Right? Like we said with the feathered cloaks, limiting prestige goods is the key. Their value comes from their rarity. If they're not rare, they don't have that kind of prestige.